There has never been a better time in history to be born female.
No interviewer, no journalist, just two legends.
Thank you for giving us 2 words and a hashtag that help free us, because we are all Me Too's.
Power only understands power. Power will look for weakness in the opponent. I do not reflect weakness.
My time with the Spice Girls, when we put our energies and ambitions together, we were formidable.
I did question, why am I here? Continually throughout my life.
And it was a total shock to see right across Africa, forests disappearing, chimpanzee numbers dropping.
Foreign correspondents can be in this very, very precarious position of actually tilting things.
Trailblazing women sharing their truths and how they created their unique path to success. Inspiring, revealing, empowering. This episode of The Power of Women is Jane Goodall, groundbreaking primatologist and anthropologist. Virginia McKenna, actress, wildlife campaigner, founder of the Born Free Foundation.
So when I say the great spiritual power, yes, it's nature, but it's also something more than that.
A little boy put up his hand and he said, "Please, miss, why do people kill lions?"
It's so lovely to see you, Jane. I was trying to remember how long ago it was that we actually did see each other, and you correct me if I'm wrong, but I have a funny feeling it might have been the early 70s, when Hugo, your first husband, and my Bill were making documentaries together under the banner of, I think it was it The Wonderful World of Jane Goodall? Was that what it was called, the series?
Might have been.
Oh, you see, you're worse than me at remembering. But I think it was then that we met briefly.
Yeah, I'm sure it wasn't before that.
And here we are again, all these many years later, yes.
You know, I'm really curious how you began and what was it like acting with Elsa and things like that.
Oh my goodness me, well, that's all, everything goes a long way back, doesn't it? That's even further back. That's the mid-60s, when Bill and I went to Kenya to make the film Born Free. Not with the real Elsa, of course, who died earlier, but with a cast of lions of different ages, sizes and sexes. And we worked closely with about 5 and got to know them very well. It took about 10.5 months to make the film. And that's, I think, where the seed was sown regarding our interest in wildlife. Because when you work closely with animals, as you well know more than anyone else, you develop relationships with certain individuals more than others, like with humans, I suppose. We never forgot that. And one of the saddest things, actually, for us, was at the end of the film, and this happened before we knew anything about it, it was all signed and sealed, that the producers had sold most of the lands to zoos and safari parks, and 2 particular ones, Mara, who went to Whipsnade in England, and little Elsa, who went with her. That was why Bill made his first documentary film, called The Lions Are Free, because he wanted to talk and show people the story of what could happen to lions, even ones that had been used to being with people, how they could be returned to the wild, which George did with the 3 we managed to save, and then the ones that we couldn't save. And we had this most distressing visit to Whipsnade Zoo when I saw Mara and called her, and she recognized my voice, as you know they do. I couldn't greet her because the wire was in between. So in a way, that was the first seed, which was deeply planted.
Wonderful, the amazing Virginia McKenna.
During the 1950s, Virginia McKenna rose to become one of the nation's most beloved film stars, playing some of the most iconic on-screen heroines of the time. While portraying Joy Adamson in the 1966 Academy Award-winning Born Free, Virginia's life was to take on a whole new direction. She set up ZooCheck, which then became the Born Free Foundation, and is now her legacy. Since its humble beginnings, the Born Free Foundation has saved hundreds of thousands of animals around the world, created sanctuaries, and launched campaigns across 6 continents, raising millions to make sure animals are set free and cared for wherever they are.
You cannot believe that from 20 years ago till now, we're still allowing wild animals to live in the most hideous conditions. Never stop looking, never stop searching, never stop being fascinated. Keep your spirit of adventure alive. So let's all do whatever we can to help each other, to help the animals, and to save what is left of our beautiful, beautiful planet.
Basically, that means this is me, this is Jane.
Jane Goodall has changed our perception of what it is to be human. With her research on chimpanzee behaviour, she's challenged old definitions and assumptions.
And I read about this glorious Lord of the Jungle. And what did he do? He married that other wimpy Jane.
And she was always an inspiration to me. She was always one of those women and one of those voices that just helped me feel better about life.
I went to Africa as a scientist. I left the jungle as an activist. Who's more intelligent, chimpanzees or American politicians? Well, I have to say, it depends on the American politician. These young people, when they understand the problems and you empower them to take action, then they are changing the world. And my goodness, don't we need to change the world?
Yes, yes.
I would like to totally be exactly like Jane when I grow up.
Never forget that every single day that you live, you make a difference, you impact the world, and you have a choice as to what kind of impact you're going to make.
All right, that's it.
Okay.
Thank you.
But what about when you were a little girl growing up? Did you have animals?
Yes, well, I personally didn't, but my father had animals which I deeply disapprove of now. We lived in a maisonette in Hampstead. He had 2 bush babies, a parrot in a cage, a snake called George, and dogs and cats and that sort of thing. And a little cage in my nursery, I had these budgies. Luckily, one day, I forgot to shut the door of the cage when I was cleaning it. And the window happened to be open. I thought even an hour of freedom was better than a lifetime in a cage for a bird.
I had 2 birds in my life like that. But you know, I was born loving animals. People say, where did your love of animals start? And I was born that way.
Yes.
My favorite story, I think, when everything began, what sort of determined me, was 4.5 years old. And Mum took me for a holiday into the country. We lived in London. Sort of in the middle, so not many animals there. This was on a farm. It was my father's mother's farm. And cows, horses, pigs, face to face in the days before the cruel factory farms.
Sure.
And I remember it vividly, and I was given a job to help collect the hens' eggs. Hens pecking around in the farmyard, you know, the way hens should.
Yeah.
And they laid their eggs in these little wooden hen houses, and the nest boxes around the edge. So I would go around with my little basket, and if there was an egg, pop it in the basket. But then apparently I began asking everybody, but where's the hole? Where does the egg come out of the hen? Because I couldn't see a hole like that. And obviously nobody told me.
Yeah.
And what I do remember vividly is seeing a hen climbing up this ramp. And I thought, I must have thought, she's going to lay an egg. So I crawled after her. Big mistake. Flew out, squawks of fear. And I suppose in my little 4-year-old mind, I must have thought, well, this is a dangerous hen house. No hen will come here. And so I went into an empty one and waited. And I was gone for 4 hours. My family had no idea where I was. It was beginning to get dusk.
Yes.
Mum called the police. They were all searching. And yet, you know, think how fearful she must have been. But when she saw this excited little girl rushing towards the house, all covered in straw, instead of getting mad at me, you know, how dare you go off without telling us? Don't you dare do that again. She saw my shining eyes and sat down to hear the wonderful story. So isn't that the making of a little scientist? The curiosity,
yes.
Asking questions, not getting the right answer, deciding to find out for yourself, making a mistake, not giving up, and learning patience.
There you are, and you've carried it on right to this
Yes,
day.
and a different mother might have crushed all that.
But you did have a very exceptional mother, didn't you? Because when you went when you first started your work, didn't your mother come and live in the camp with you?
Well, you know, the very first time I went to Africa, Mum didn't come with me. My dream of Africa began when I was 10.
Right.
And Dr. Dolittle, you must remember Dr.
Indeed,
Dolittle.
absolutely.
And then Tarzan, because I found this little book, no Tarzan movies, and I could just afford it. We had very little money, and I took it home and I read it from cover to cover. And of course I fell passionately in love with this glorious Lord of the Jungle. And what did he do? He married the wrong Jane.
That was a bit rotten of him, wasn't it?
I was so jealous. So anyway, that was when my dream really began. I will grow up, go to Africa, live with wild animals and write books about them. And everybody laughed. How will you get there? You don't have money, there's a war, and you're just a girl. Not Mum. She said, if you really want something, you're going to have to work really hard, take advantage of opportunity, but don't give up. So there was that support. Left school, no money for university, just enough money for a boring old typewriting secretarial course, you know, bookkeeping, typing on those old typewriters that nobody could use now.
Yes.
And got a boring job in London, and then a school friend invited me to Kenya, your Kenya, and the kind of Kenya that you remember.
Yes.
And so it was very exciting, and I had to earn money by being a waitress for the fair.
Yeah.
And off I went. I think it was so amazing. You know, back then I was 23, which today, you know, we were very naive. Well, I was. Mum let me go. That's what I think is so amazing.
You did have a brilliant mum, didn't you?
She was amazing.
Yes.
So anyway, that amazing journey by boat, because planes didn't go back and forth. You know, when you and I talk, with the years we go back, we've lived through so much, haven't we?
Because I went when I was 9. Because I was evacuated in the war and went to South Africa.
Oh.
And in South Africa, without realizing it, that must have been another seed that was sown, because I saw my first wild lions in Kruger. A school friend asked me to go for the weekend with her and her family. And the only lions I'd seen before were in London Zoo. And that time, they didn't have an outdoor thing. They just had this long sort of stone shed building with iron doors at each end. And the lions, you probably remember, were sort of walking up and down. And I can hear it to this day, the clang, the metal clang of the door as it shut. And the contrast between that memory and seeing this pride of lions under a tree in Kruger, these are the two images that I've kept right through my life. The contrast of how we keep animals, think about them, think we learn about them. And I suppose that really was the first seeds that were sown within.
Well, you know, when I got to Africa to stay with my friend, remember I told you that boring secretarial course?
Oh, yes, tap, tap.
Somebody told me, Jane, if you're interested in animals, you should meet Louis Leakey.
Oh.
So I rang up and said I'd like to speak to Louis, to come and have a meeting with Louis Leakey. And I've always said, I'm Leakey, what do you want? You know, he hated the telephone. He was very rude on the telephone. Yes, always. And so, anyhow, he agreed I could go and see him. He took me all around the museum. He was very impressed by how much I knew, because I'd read every book about Africa. And in London, I spent hours in the Natural History Museum. And guess what? His secretary had left the week before, and he needed a secretary. How amazing. Opportunities come, and we just have to grab them. So that's how it began, working for Leakey, going to Olduvai in the days when all the animals were there. No road, not even a track to Olduvai. And, you know, giraffe wandering around, lions, rhinos all over the place. One evening I met a lion, one of, you know, your people. I met the lion, it followed. It was with this one other young girl.
Right.
Followed us, I don't know, a quarter of a mile, I suppose, which was scary, but it was very exciting.
Of course.
And I think it was that evening around the campfire that Leakey asked me if I'd like to study.
He recognized something in you, though, Jane, didn't he?
He obviously did. Yes, he did. Because I was so at home immediately, at home in Africa.
But then you were there for years, weren't you?
First of all, he had to try and find money. So I had to go back to England for a year while he found the money. And then, second problem, back then Tanzania was Tanganyika.
Yes.
The crumbling British Empire, one of the last outposts. And the authorities were not prepared to take responsibility for this young girl. In the end, they said, all right, but she must have a companion.
And that's when your mother...
That's when my mother volunteered to come. And it was amazing because she set up a little clinic and she became known as the White Witch Doctor. So right from the beginning, she established this great relationship with the local people.
Yes, well, she had her own role to fulfill, didn't she, there?
She also boosted my morale because the chimps were running away, running away, running away. And, you know, I knew if I had time, it would be okay, but the money was running out.
How did you eventually win the trust of that you could sit or watch from a distance your first lot of chimps that didn't run away? How did you come to that point when they stopped being scared of you?
It was one male.
Okay.
I called him David Greybeard. It was very distinctive, very white beard. And for some reason, he sometimes came down and fed in the fig trees over the fishermen huts. So, you know, why? We don't know. Couldn't ask him. So he began to let me come a bit closer. And I think in a way, he really helped me to get to know his friends in the forest. Because going back to Mum for a second, it was just 2 weeks after she left that the breakthrough. That was seeing David Greybeard using grass stems as a tool to fish the termites, picking leafy twigs and making a tool by stripping off the leaves. And, you know, at that time, science had decided we were the only tool-using, tool-making creature on the planet. And Leakey sent a telegram back to me. Well, now we shall have to redefine man, redefine tool, or accept chimpanzees as humans. And that brought in National Geographic. And they sent photographer, filmmaker Hugo van Lauwijk. And we married, as you know.
I mean, your life has been quite extraordinary, because you didn't bob in and out. You were there for years, weren't you?
Oh, from 1960, most of every year up until 1986. But how did you feel when you first interacted with lions? And why were they tame? What had happened to them?
Well, they weren't really tame. Well, the first two that they'd chosen, selected for us to work with, were actually from a circus in Holland. They were 9, so they were actually quite large, and they came with a young German trainer and a circus trainer, and we had to wear these leather wrist guards in case they lashed out and cut a vein and we bled to death. And then we had to hold these sticks, 2 little sticks, not to hit them, but to hold them in certain positions which they understood, so they would go this way or sit down or whatever it happened to be. And Bill and I used to go home in the evening at the end of our so-called training session in sort of despair, because we thought, how can we tell a love story when we can only behave when we're told we can do something? We can't do anything impulsively or naturally. So, in a way, fortune was on our side, because one day he'd gone in for his so-called training session in the enclosure with one of the lionesses called Astra and Monica the trainer, and Astra was in the most terrible mood. And you could tell, well, you can tell, can't you, from animal behavior and how they look if they're cross. And she was desperate to get at him, and he managed to get out. And the producers were standing watching, going paler by the minute, because they thought they'd lost their leading man, I think. And they withdrew both these lionesses from any close work at all. In fact, only one of them is in the film. When there's a scene, you might, if you've seen the film, might remember that a lioness is chased across the plains by a warthog, and then the warthog sort of kept bashing her in the side, and the poor lioness doesn't know what's going on. That was one of the circus lions, but that was the only time a circus lion was used. Otherwise, these other lions, which came from all over the place, 2 from the Scots Guards Regiment in Nairobi, several from Nairobi Animal Orphanage, some cubs from Haile Selassie, and in the end we had over 20 lions of different shapes and sizes. Particularly with 4 or 5, we started to develop a proper relationship. And particularly with the Scots Guards, 2, boy and girl, we used to take them on the plains for exercise in the morning. And then George Adamson, who was our inspiration, frankly, and our teacher, he then joined us, and we all went out together. And
what year was that?
64.
64, okay.
And you, in 64, you were where?
Still at Gombe.
There you were.
I started in 60.
Started in 64. And so, at the end of the film, as I just said, they all went to the zoos except for 3. And Bill made his first documentary film, which I think was in 67. Yes, about what happened to some of the lions, and George's little camp where he had the 3 that we managed to save. And from then on, he started to make documentary films. And then in 68, he and James Hill, who directed Born Free, wanted to make a film about elephants. And we went to Tsavo in Kenya, and where the Sheldricks, Daphne and David Sheldrick, he was the chief warden and she was there rescuing animals already.
Yes.
And she had 2 teenage elephants, but we wanted a small one for the story. And the government had just captured a 2-year-old from the park to give to London Zoo as a gift.
Oh, it's so horrible when they do that.
I'm afraid they...
Still going on doing that sort of thing.
Yeah, well, yes, not London, luckily.
I mean, zoos in general.
Oh, yes.
Well, it's getting much better, but...
I think perhaps some of us are. In the Far East, they still seem to want animals from the wild, don't they? Particularly a lot of elephants. Zimbabwe sent up quite a few recently.
Zimbabwe. Well, all those elephants.
Oh,
horrible.
Horrible, wasn't it?
Yes, disgusting.
So anyway, this little 2-year-old came to us. We were allowed to use her in our film, and she was lovely, and she was just heavenly. And we were so friendly with her, and she with us, and we asked if we could buy her and give her to the Sheldricks. And they said we could, but they'd have to capture another one, because the present was promised. So we said, we can't allow another little one to be captured and the family destroyed. So she came to London Zoo. And many years later, probably about 12, we had a letter from Daphne saying something, she'd heard something was going to happen to Poli Poli, the little elephant, now a teenager. She'd become very difficult and, of course, was displaying stereotypic behaviour, and she was on her own, and she had a little stump of a tusk, and it was just horrible. And I'd found a place in South Africa who'd love to have had her, go back into the wild with someone to teach her and all the rest of it. But the zoo said no, but they would allow her to go to Whipsnade where there were elephants. Unfortunately, the day came and they kept her standing so long in the crate, traveling crate, that she fell and damaged her leg very badly. And they took her in and she hobbled around for a few days. And they looked at her leg under anesthetic and said, it was broken or something, and then they put her down because they said she'd lost the will to live. Well, that I can believe. That was our catalyst. All the seed that was sown in the 60s with Born Free suddenly became a plant in a way. And we said, that's it, we've got to do something. We can't just be us. So we started our little group in '84 called Zoo Check. And Zoo Check is still part of Born Free, but it's not called that anymore. We call Born Free Foundation now. Jane, I hope you don't mind if I ask you to do something rather unusual. And that is not to speak with your human voice, but to speak with your chimp voice. I hear you're absolutely brilliant.
Well, it's the way I start many of my lectures, and people expect it now.
Oh, right.
And it's the distance call, the greeting. So I'm greeting the people up in the gallery, but because they're far away.
Yes.
And that basically means this is me, this is Jane. And because chimpanzees don't travel around in a group like gorillas and monkeys, but sometimes one individual alone, a group of males hanging out, females with their children, or one mother and her young. If an adolescent daughter kind of loses touch with her mother, because they have quite close bonds, she'll give that call. And then if the mother hears the call, she'll know it's her daughter, because they all have their own individual calls. So it's a very important call.
And what happens if this call comes and there's no response, then does the one who's made the call get very agitated because no one has replied?
Well, they'll make it several times, and then they go and, you know, look somewhere else.
Look, yes.
Yes, because they generally know the rough direction. So, Virginia, can you make any of the lion sounds?
I'll do my best. It'll be absolutely useless, and people will mock me, I think, for the rest of my days. They sort of go,
That's after the roar.
I mean, that's not, yes, after the roar.
Yes. And then it.
Yes, then it sort of fades away.
You know, it's been fascinating with the chimpanzees to learn the different calls. Communication among chimps, where it resembles ours so closely, is communication by touch, gesture, posture, kissing, embracing, holding hands, patting one another, swaggering, shaking the fist, throwing rocks, and then, of course, there's the tool using, and those close bonds between mother and child, which has always been my favorite thing.
Yes.
It's the same with elephants.
Exactly.
That's why taking babies is so awful. But, you know, in the old days, mother-child bond in humans was very often closer than it is today.
Were you ever frightened at all by a chimp or chimps? Scary
Well, we've had a succession of 3 adult males who are bullies, and 2 of them from the same family. And, you know, when they're wanting to show off or be in charge, you know, challenging each other for dominance, they have this display when they stick their hair out and they charge across the ground, and they stamp with their feet, slap with their hands, they throw rocks, they drag branches. They're trying to make themselves look big and intimidating. And all of these 3 males at different times would do that to me.
Would they?
And as they're about 8 times stronger.
What did you do?
You couldn't do anything.
Did you stand your ground, or
couldn't.
did you?
They're too strong. I got dragged a few times.
Really?
So fortunately, while I was being dragged, the worst one was Frodo. And not a bit like his namesake from Lord of the Rings, I have to say. And he dragged me, he came back, he dragged me again, he stamped on me. But you see, he wasn't trying to really hurt or kill me. He was trying to dominate me. And I kept thinking, Frodo, I know you're dominant. You do not have to do this. But if he'd wanted to kill me, I would be dead. I wouldn't be here. There's no question. And in fact, several times when he could have killed me, like I'm on the edge of one of these sheer drops, and he comes charging along. Normally he would push, but he didn't. So, you see, he knew what he was doing. Strange.
Isn't it?
Treating me almost as though he thought I was another dominant male chimp, which of course is ridiculous. But were you ever scared with the lions?
I found, as I said earlier, that the circus lions are a bit scary, but then that was inevitable, really. It wasn't their fault. I did have one slightly hairy moment, which I always knew wasn't done out of any anger against me or anything. It was just the circumstance. And it was before we started filming, and Bill and I were out on an old airstrip with boy and girl, the 2 Scots Guards mascots, lambs. And just on our own, we took them for a nice romp. And just ahead of us in the bush, we saw some Thompson's gazelle. And the lions, of course, spotted them straight away. And so they started to stalk them. And they kept looking back at us. And Bill said, I think they want us to stalk with them. So we got down on our hands and knees, and we were sort of going through the very prickly grass. And my knees were so sore that I got up and gave them a rub. And just then, Boy turned round and looked at me. And Bill said, careful, I think he's going to jump. And I think he jumped because I looked easier than the gazelle. I was nearer. So he leapt, and Bill's got this photograph of him leaping in the air like this, and he landed on my shoulders, and I sort of fell to the ground, and I heard this click, and then my ankle had gone. Luckily, a few days before, they hadn't wanted to come back into the Land Rover, and Bill had taken off his shirt and ran to the Land Rover, sort of wiggling it through the bush and the grass. And they loved it, you see, they followed him straight away, so he did it again now. he took off his shirt and wiggled it and got back to the Land Rover and then came back for me and picked me up, and it was actually quite painful, I seem to remember.
Of course it was.
Frightful. But then the great thing, Jane, was that the first day I came back into camp, and Bill and George and the two lions are just coming back from their walk, and I wound the window down and called Boy, and he stopped and he came and he put half his body through the open window and gave me such a welcome.
Lovely.
So I absolutely knew it wasn't because he was aggressive to me. It was the circumstance. And after that, of course, we just carried on as before.
And maybe he was angry because you stood up.
I think we weren't playing our part correctly,
Yeah.
were we?
No, you weren't.
No, I know. We are so lucky, Jane, though, aren't we, to have had that. Well, you for much longer than me, and you know, you are a proper animal person. I'm just sort of an actress who got involved with animals. It's very, very different. I'm no scientist, I can tell you.
When you say no scientist, when I began, I wasn't a scientist. And then Leakey told me I had to go to Cambridge.
Yes, you see, you did, yes.
And when I got there, I was nervous. You know, I'd never been, and he got me a place to do a PhD at Cambridge in ethology. I didn't even know what ethology was. You know, I think scientists like long words because it makes them feel important, because nobody knows what they're talking about. And it's just animal behaviors, you know. And imagine how I felt. Nervous. And to be told by many of the professors that I'd done everything wrong. I shouldn't have given the chimpanzees names. They should have had numbers. That was scientific.
Oh dear.
Couldn't talk about them having personality or minds or emotions, because those were unique to us. I was guilty of anthropomorphism.
Okay.
And fortunately, I'd had a wonderful teacher when I was a child. And he taught me that, at least in this respect, those professors were completely wrong. And that was my dog, Rusty.
And you had to get through that kind of challenge and overt criticism and all the rest of it and sort of emerge from that, didn't you? And I suppose you were very courageous, I think, to do this and to take on the challenge of going to university. I suppose I have to say that ours were somewhat different, because we weren't at all clever people at university or anything like that. When we wanted to help the little elephant Poly and go to a better life, we were challenging the status quo. We were challenging the world of captivity, and I suppose in a strange way. I always felt I was very lucky having been an actress, and Bill felt the same, because we were quite used to criticism. Actors get a lot of criticism from the press and all over the place, but we didn't actually care what they thought, because we had to do something to look into the situation of wild animals in captivity. Poly the elephant became the symbol of what we tried to do. And particularly, when I say particularly elephants, solitary elephants in captivity have a really horrendous time, and there are very many still to this day.
Oh, yeah.
They were all frightfully clever and knew much more than we did, but it didn't matter, because our focus was the animal. That's what we cared about. And that's when we started looking around zoos in all sorts of countries. And in fact, I've just done a bit of a zoo check in the south of France, and it's virtually the same as it was then, and it was ghastly then, and it's ghastly now. And I know you care very much about sea creatures. So I went to Marineland, and of course there it's just a concrete zoo, and it's deeply sad that we still want to keep animals, sort of living animals who travel miles and miles in the ocean and have family groups, family connections and relationships, stuck in a concrete pool doing silly tricks for a few visitors. I mean, I find that deeply scandalous.
They are being closed down. People are beginning to understand. It's changing. It takes time, you know.
But it isn't enough time for some of the animals, is it?
No, absolutely not. And people think of slaves.
Yeah.
I mean, yes, we're cruel to animals, but we're cruel to each other too. My goodness, we are.
And still.
Yes, and still. I think again, I go back to my mother, because she always said, you know, if you meet people who disagree with you, number one, listen to them, because they may have some points you haven't thought of. Two, if after you've discussed, and she said, don't get angry, don't get violent, just discuss. But then if you still feel that you're righter than they are, then you must have the courage of your conviction.
Exactly.
So I was lucky at Cambridge. How I got through that one is my supervisor was Professor Robert Hind, And he was at first my sternest critic, then he came to Gombe, and he said, 2 weeks there has taught me more about animal behavior than the rest of my life put together. In 1986, I went to a conference. We brought all the chimp people together studying chimps in Africa and some captive situations, non-invasive. And we had a session on conservation, and it was a total shock to see right across Africa, forests disappearing, chimpanzee numbers dropping, the beginning of the bushmeat trade, shooting mothers to catch babies, like baby elephants and baby lions are caught. And also, chimps are so like us that they're susceptible to human disease. But then we had a session at that same conference on conditions in some captive situations, chimps in bad zoos, and chimps in circuses, entertainment. But worst of all, what gave me nightmares, chimps in medical research. Tiny cages, 5 foot by 5 foot. So I've always felt that if you want to do something about something, you must have first-hand knowledge.
Absolutely.
So I braced myself and I got into the labs. They let me in and saw the chimps with my own eyes. And you know, because I then sat down with the researchers and talked about it, and talked about how chimps are in the wild, a lot of the animal rights people wouldn't speak to me. They said, how can you drink a cup of coffee with them? And I said, but if you don't speak to them, how can you expect them to change?
You can't influence them if you don't.
You can't influence them. So it's taken a long time, but finally National Institutes of Health in America, all of its 400 chimps are now going into sanctuary.
Right.
And I just have met with many of them just very recently in Chimp Haven.
How wonderful.
So, you know.
It's what they deserve, for goodness sake, isn't it?
Yeah. So my mother gave me that sense of, you know, be true to yourself.
Sure.
But then also out in the forest, which is where I love to be, that sense of interconnectedness.
Sure.
And very strong a sense of a great spiritual power that's, you know, I don't know. Nature, or, I mean, more and more and more today, top scientists are coming to the conclusion the universe wasn't an accident. There is intelligence behind it. So when I say the great spiritual power, yes, it's nature.
Yes, the feeling when you go into forests or into nature, and the feeling in a way something bigger than all of us that is looking over us and guiding us in some way, in a very profound way. I agree with you. I feel the same when I go into nature. I would just like to add a little sort of PS to that, and that is that I believe that we should have this kind of understanding and concern and compassion for any creature whatsoever that feels anything. You know, we tend to think of animals sometimes as over there somewhere and something else, but we know their love for each other, their protection of each other, their loyalty to each other, their defense of each other, and struggling to survive, as you say, with all the forests and places being destroyed, struggling to stay alive and keep their families together. And you've had probably more experience than any of us in that field because of the destruction of the habitat for the chimps.
Well, the lions are now endangered.
Absolutely.
Nobody ever thought lions would be endangered.
There are only 20,000 left in the whole of Africa now.
No, and the rhinos are going so fast, and the elephants too. And it's
But that's not just because of habitat, you see, destruction. That's also because people want bits of them, body
that's
parts.
the point.
Yes.
Tusks and horn.
Yes.
Horn is now worth more than gold, more than heroin.
And lamb bone wine instead of tiger bone wine.
And tiger bone, yeah.
Everything. It's
Everything.
absolutely horrendous.
It's human greed.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's destroyed a lot of the world that I knew when I was young, a lot of the world that you knew when you were young. And, you know, you sometimes wonder if there is some being, some spiritual power up there. I don't know. I feel I get strength from that spiritual power. Yes. I feel that in the forest.
Yes.
People have always tried to make a separation between us and animals. So when I went to Cambridge, it was a difference in kind. That's what I was told. So we were separate. That's what the scientists said. And then gradually, because chimps are biologically so like us, as well as behaviourally, they kind of had to accept. And I got my PhD and everything. I think it's just been very gradual that acceptance that we are part of and not separated from the rest of the animal kingdom has led to other animals gradually being drawn into this circle of consciousness. I've met a lot of scientists very high in their fields, like Nobel Prize winners in physics and neurophysics and things, who've all come to the same conclusion, that there is an intelligence behind the universe.
Yes.
And that intelligence is what we might call God. My mother always taught me that, if you've been brought up as a Christian, we weren't religious particularly, but, we went to church. But she said if you'd been born in Egypt or somewhere like that, you'd probably be a Muslim. You'd worship Allah. Yes. Or you might worship Jehovah.
Yes.
Or it might be Tao. It depends where you're born, what your culture is.
Yes.
But just about all people have always worshipped some kind of superior spiritual being. Yes. Always. So, when people say, what's your next adventure? I say, well, probably dying. Because when you die, there's either nothing, which, okay, or there's something. And if there's something, which I happen to believe,
so do I,
good, then that's going to be the greatest adventure of our lives, isn't it? Discovering what that something is.
Absolutely. And of course, in a funny way, what you're saying relates to animals too, because Elsa the lioness, they always call it the spirit of Elsa. Her spirit, although she's dead been a long time now, her spirit and her memory lives to this day. Surely there must be compassion for any creature that can feel. Take the elephants, which I know you love too. They mourn when the old ones die, or the babies die, or whatever. They protect each other. The family looks after the little ones. They mourn when one is taken away. It's just, they're so like us, or we're like them. And why do we keep separating everything?
Well,
it's got to be joined up, hasn't it?
And it's getting more so.
Yeah.
I think it really is. I think elephants are actually nicer than chimps. Chimps are too like people. There's nice ones and nasty ones. And I guess there's rogue elephants too, but those are usually the ones that are in captivity and chains and and the way they're treated in Asia. Oh, it's so awful, so terrible.
It is terrible.
For a very long time, it started when 4 of my students at Gombe were kidnapped and taken over Lake Tanganyika to what's now DRC, Congo.
Oh, right.
The research station had to be closed down. I had to leave. And I guess that was the greatest challenge of my life, because the money then dried up, and I couldn't let Gombe go. So I had to go around all the people who'd previously supported me and talk to them. And there were terrible rumors that I had abandoned the students, which was so ridiculous. I didn't even know the kidnapping had happened. I was with my little boy. Anyway, it was a very disappointing time, the number of people who turned their backs on me at this difficult time.
Have they come back to you now? Some of those people?
Oh, all but one. And so when all these rumors I heard were going around about the way I'd abandoned the students and only thought of my own skin, I girded my loins and went to all those people around the country and talked. And they, all but one said, we're so glad you came because we just couldn't believe this.
Right too.
And that's when the Jane Goodall Institute was started by friends of mine who said, well, Jane, you've got to be independent of all these grants and things. You've got to be able to raise your own money, which we're still struggling to do, by the way.
I mean, we've got 2 sanctuaries. We've got a big cat sanctuary in South Africa, lions rescued from circuses and hideous captive conditions. And in Ethiopia, we have a huge sanctuary now, which has a great mix of species, not chimps. But we do have primates, which were kept in this ghastly cafe I went there for the rescue, and they were living in these dark, barren cages. It was horrendous. Anyway, we've got them now. We've got birds, and we've got hyenas, and giant tortoises, and big cats. And in the old days, people used to smuggle baby cheetah wrapped up in bags or in boxes across the border to go to the Middle East as pets. But now we've got the sanctuary, of course. They get in touch with us. And so we've got all these cheetah now, thank God.
Yeah.
But why do people... It's a status symbol again, you see. It's about us. It's always about us, isn't it?
Yeah. Yes, we've got the biggest sanctuary for orphan chimps in Africa, in the Republic of Congo.
Yeah.
It's about 170 now.
Have you? Gosh, it's wonderful.
There's a program starting to try and release some of them back into the wild.
Yes.
And as it is, we've got these 3 huge forested islands on the Kwilu River.
Yes.
And that almost all the chimps that can be released into a semi-wild are there. And then just some of those will be chosen to try and make it out in the wild. But it's not easy.
No.
So Virginia, if you look back over your life, and we're about the same age.
Yes, I'm a bit older than you.
How old are you?
I'm 86.
Oh, yes, you are.
I am?
I'm only 84.
Oh, lucky thing.
Oh. I'm a baby.
You are a tiny baby.
Okay, well, look back through your 86 years. What do you think's the most important or meaningful thing that you've accomplished?
The thing I'm grateful about is that when we started 33 years ago with our charity, not many people talked about captive wildlife or cared about captive wildlife. Of course, a few here and there. But now, things really have changed. More and more people, when they go and see a circus or a zoo or whatever it is, they look with more informed mind. And they write to us and say, I saw this and they hadn't got any shade or any water. I mean, even basic things like that. And so I think if I've just opened a few eyes more than when we started, I'm just so hugely grateful for that. And also, I don't really care, as I said earlier, about the criticisms and all that because, well, I just don't, because the issues mean more to me than the criticism. What about you?
Well, I have to say 2 things.
Yeah.
And one I've talked about already, and that's the beginning of people thinking about animals as individual beings worthy of names, whether they're wild or captive or whatever.
Yeah.
But the other, which we haven't talked about at all, is, you know, we've talked about the state of the world today, and we haven't mentioned, well, deforestation, pollution of the ocean, loss of biodiversity. Trophy hunting, climate change, all of these things which we have inflicted on poor old planet
You're
Earth.
quite right.
And how bizarre that the biggest difference between us and the other animals is this explosive development of our intellect. And, you know, we've designed a rocket that went up to Mars.
Yes.
And a little robot that crawled off taking photos. We've seen what it looks like on the only planet which people have said might support life. And we don't want to live there, do we? We've seen those photos. So how is it possible that the most intellectual creature that's ever lived on the planet is destroying its only home? And I think a disconnect between the clever brain and the human heart, love and compassion. You know, it was Gandhi who said, the planet can provide enough for human need, but not human greed. When I began this traveling around the world, when I left Gombe after that conference in '86, traveled around Africa, saw the problems facing the chimps, but also the problems facing the people.
Sure.
The desperate poverty, the lack of good education and health facilities. And flew over Gombe that was once part of this great forest belt, and looking down, so it was a tiny island of forest surrounded by completely bare hills, with more people living there than the land could support. Knowing that unless we got those people as our partners, we couldn't even try to save the chimps. So started our JGI program to improve the lives of the people that's now in 7 different African countries in and around chimp habitats. But what's the point of all this hard work, raising money, doing what you're doing, if the next generation isn't going to grow up to be better stewards than we've been? And so that's when I started our youth program, Roots and Shoots.
Yes.
Started with 12 high school students in Tanzania.
Yeah.
It's now in 100 countries. We've got about 150,000 active groups.
Fantastic.
And a group can be a whole school, which in China is huge.
Yeah.
And it's different from other youth organizations because the young people choose their own projects. One to help people,
Yes.
one to help animals or other animals, because we are animals, and one to help the environment. You know, the hope for the future lies in these next generations.
I absolutely agree with you on a very much more modest scale. I have to say straight away, we have an education arm which is called Global Friends, and we help schools in Africa. We also are planting trees with children. We have a child each and we plant the trees. And the time before I went, I was chatting to the school, to the children, and we was coming to the end, and a little boy put up his hand and he said, "Please, miss, why do people kill lions?" You know, it gave me such comfort that he thought that it wasn't the right thing to do. If that little boy of 9 can think like that, there is hope.
Yeah, there is hope.
Yeah.
We should collaborate.
We must.
We should get your program and Roots and Shoots together.
It'd be lovely, wouldn't it?
Wouldn't it? Why don't we?
Why don't we?
Let's do it.
That's our project.
Shake.